Thank you, Tuka. Thank you, Lina, for the invitation. Just to be transparent, I'm also part of the French Data Protection Authority, and I'm also part of a non-for-profit called VECAN, which has been working for 20 years on society and digital issues. So, let me start. First, so the idea today is to try to work together. This is just an ongoing thought. It's just food for thought. How can we have collective approaches of empowerment around our data? So just to give a little bit of framework, you know that in all societies, the weight which is given to the individual, to the person on the one hand, and to the collective, to the group, to the community on the other hand, is different. Of course, it's not the same in Senegal and in Finland, for instance. And in Western countries, it's been changing dramatically at the end of the 20th century, giving more and more importance to the individual, to the person. This is due to many reasons. One of them is, of course, the social movements of the 16th, which wanted to alleviate the weight of the family on the person, and it's also the result of the consumption society that we are going through. And this evolution in the Western countries has impacted two key concepts that are key concepts for our conference, which are the privacy and the empowerment. So why did it impact, how did it impact privacy? The privacy conception we have now, and if we go back to the very beginning of our legal system, I'm talking about the 40-year-old law that we have had in France, but which inspired the whole European system. It's all focused on the individual rights. And especially the data is protected as long as it is identified, that means as long as it is related to a person. When it's not related to a person, there is no more privacy for the data. So you see, this is a move towards an individualistic-centric thing. When we look at empowerment, we have a similar evolution. Empowerment, the word appeared in the 60s, and it was rooted in social movements, in collective movements. It was inspired by the Saul Alinsky community organizing concept, and it was pushed by feminist movements. It was pushed by social workers who were working with black communities in the suburbs in American cities. So from scratch, empowerment was threefold. It was individual capacity to increase your skill. It was the capacity to work together in a community to gain some power. And it was also a political dimension of gaining, as a citizen, power into the society. So, but during the 80s, 90s, and nowadays, this three-dimension empowerment has shifted to a one-dimension. One of the factors, it's not the only one, but one of the factors is the fact that the international institutions, such as the World Bank, they have been focusing on the individual approach of empowerment. And now you hear about customer empowerment, you hear about advertisement with empowerment, etc. And it's only focusing on the individual aspect of empowerment. So we have to maybe shift back to the full, comprehensive understanding of empowerment. So what happens when digitalization and dataification comes into the framework? We face two paradoxes. The first one, I won't expand on this because Lynette Taylor tomorrow morning in the plenary will talk about this. But there is a kind of paradox. On the one hand, we have a GDPR focusing on the individual, but on the other hand, we have problems with groups. When people are anonymized, their privacy can still be at stake, their privacy can still be hurted. I won't say more about this. Come tomorrow morning and listen to Lynette. When we talk about empowerment, there is another paradox. This other paradox is due to the fact that the way the innovators which created the tools we are using now, in the 70s, yesterday Yogi was mentioning in the opening session, he was talking about Stewart Barnes, so that one of those guys who played a major role. They were inspired when they created the personal computer, the first virtual communities, when they created also what was going to be the protocols of the web and the internet, etc., Tom Berners-Lee, etc. They were inspired by an utopia of the tool the digital tools, the technical tools, as levers for individual and collective empowerment. And they wanted to root that in distributed technologies. But where are we now? We are not in facing distributed technologies. We are facing a world of monopolies that capture our data, and they are capturing also what the economists call the use value. The use value is not necessarily the way they monetize the data, but the capacity to use the data for any purposes, to get some social value, for instance. So how can we get out of this? This is my question that I want to address this morning. How can we get free our personal data from those silos in order to share the use value and give it maybe different orientations? When I say different orientations, I mean, of course, some of the services we are using are just great, but there are other purposes, social purposes that the data might serve, and the startups are not aiming to serve those purposes. So I have a twofold hypothesis. The first hypothesis is that, and this relates to something which was said yesterday, we first have to defeat the idea that we as individuals, as persons, have no say on our data once they are anonymized. Today we are in a situation when the data is anonymized, it's not ours anymore. We have nothing to say on how it is used, for what purposes, etc. And I think we have to get rid of that idea. Most of the data nowadays is co-produced. It's produced by the service that we are using, of course, when we get online with Facebook or whatever, but it's produced by us. So if we think as co-producers, then we understand that we should have a word to say during the whole life of the data, not only the first part of the life of the data. And the second assumption, my second hypothesis, is that we should create data commons. So let me explain briefly. Maybe I will explain what a commons is, because this concept might not be so clear. There's a lot of confusion around the commons. And I will use Elinor Ostrom's concept theory of the commons as a background. She's the first woman who won the Nobel Prize in Economy in 2010. So a common is a shared resource. It's outside the traditional proprietary regime. And this is a very important point. I agree with one of the points that Mina put forward this morning. We have to get rid of this proprietary approach of the data. And the common can be either a forest, it could be an old hoven, how do you say, hoven? Hoven. In a village, or it can be a free software. And then you have a community, the community who manages the resource and who organize the life around the resource. The community is as much as important as the resource. And then you have a governance. A governance are the rules which will say who has what right on the resource, who can use it, who can even sell it, who will resolve the conflict in case of there is a conflict, who can take care of a free rider, etc., etc. And the rules can be, this governance can be implemented either in a manuscript like the Magna Carta, which was the first document 800 years ago, which protected the commons, or it can be implemented in a free software license. So, when we talk about data commons, the idea is that we take some of the data that we are producing, co-producing, and we try to put them in a shared way so that more social value can be taken out of it. Who could contribute to these data commons? We're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from scratch because there are already some public bodies who are contributing to the data commons when they open their data. It's a movement which has started in 2010, more or less, and it's gaining momentum. There are more and more local authorities opening their data. That's very interesting. But there is still a long way to go. At the moment, the data they provide is basically data about, how much garbage has been collected. In Paris, we have this very funny data set. Where are located the places where the movie makers shoot their movies in Paris, etc., etc. But there are also more personal data that are collected by the cities, and there will be more. It was mentioned yesterday. The more connected the city will be, the more data will be connected that will be again co-produced by our mobilities, by the way we use the utilities, etc. What about those data sets? How can we decide together with the local authority where this data, how they will be shared and what they will be used for? Apart from the public bodies, some companies might be able to contribute to the data commons. Some are starting to do it, but this is of course very marginal. The reasons for which they do it might not be the best ones, but let's forget about the reasons, the motivation, and let's see the result. For instance, Open Health, which is a French data broker specialized in health data, they have put on the French government portal for open data, they have put sets of health data that they collect from the chemistry, from the pharmacies. Another example is this data for climate action, which is a big challenge which was organized by the United Nations, and 9 companies, including Orange, have contributed to this challenge. They try to see how they can harness the data in favor of the climate, for the climate change actions. For instance, Orange gave how do you call that? The CDR, the call details record, which has obviously co-produced with the users for the challenge. Another example, but you know the reasons behind, is Uber, who released some data during the last spring, which is really useful. We all know why they released it. They want to calm down the local authorities, but maybe Francesca can tell us about this. But whatever the reason is, it's interesting. It's very useful data. Waze is also doing it, but in a different way, because it's not really a common in the sense that it's an exchange with the city, and it's not open to anyone. So what happens? I was quoting companies who are opening some data. What happens when there is sets of data produced by a company which might be of really, how do you say that, a general interest which is major for the society. Let me take an example, the Airbnb data, for instance. Some cities, some mayors say that they would like to have access to the data. Not only because they want to see how much people are renting their house, etc. Not only for surveillance, but they could use it for a very creative tourism policy. So at the moment, Airbnb is not doing the same as Uber. They keep their data. We could be in a situation when we are facing what Michael Haller calls an anti-common, when the data should be of general interest, but is still enclosed by the company. So what can we do? One solution is some data activists free the data, like Tom's Wall was one of the first ones to get the Airbnb data, but you have also this website inside Airbnb. Another example is in France, the Nos Députés website is a non-for-profit called Regard Citoyen, who scraps the data from the parliament, because the parliament was refusing to give access to the data. Now it's giving it, but it took years before they opened the data. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that public institutions make it compulsory. So up to now, I haven't seen, but maybe I'm wrong, maybe correct me, any public authority obliging a company to open and give the data as a common. We've seen it in other fields, for instance, the text and data mining research exception. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept. I don't have time to get into this, but this is when the researchers have the right to use the data which are produced by private publishers, and they can use it for research. So that's an exception to the intellectual property right, and that was established in England and in France by the parliament. But this is not personal data. So the question is, could we do the same with personal data? What about, again, all the data that we will be producing in our connected house? What will happen with all the data we will produce in the connected city? So that's just a hypothesis to be discussed. Maybe you think I'm too, how do you say, state-driven when I make this proposal, but it can be discussed. So now, a third possibility, and this really I put it as a question, an open question. Could the individual decide to provide their de-identified data to the commons? We give, or 5 minutes, okay, I hurry. We give our organs, we give our money, we give our time. Could we decide to give our personal data? We already do in a certain way. We provide data, but it's not personal. When we provide data to OpenStreetMap, to Open Food Facts, we provide data for the commons. But the same when we put our pictures online with Flickr under a Creative Commons license, then we contribute to the commons, to the data commons. But again, they are not personal data, which is a bit strange, which is a bit awkward, because on the other hand, we contribute to commercial services with personal data. When we rate on Amazon a book, this is personal data, and we do it for free. So there's a kind of paradox here. So I think we could move forward towards those personal data shared as a common. There are some initiatives which pave the way. Yesterday, 2 of them were mentioned already, the MyData.com, the Health Bank. This is a third one. The 3 examples are related with health data, but the model is different. 2 of them, the Health Bank and the MyData.com, are run as cooperative. And this is a very important point. It relates to the governance dimension of the common I was mentioning before, because that means that the people who contribute to the common, they have a control over what is done with their data. And I think this cooperativism platform approach is very enlightening. Another example which paves the way is what Ushaid is doing. I don't know if you're familiar with that platform, but they crowdsource data for research and in order to solve social problems. For instance, in this screen, what you see is that they crowdsource data about violence in the streets in the Cairo in order to improve the security of the city, or they might crowdsource data about voting incidents in the election in Kenya, just to improve the democratic process, etc., etc. So it's all crowdsourced personal information. So what would be the benefits of those data commons, enriched by both public bodies, private actors, and individuals? Of course, coming back to what Mina says as an introduction, the idea is to improve the agency of people. But also, what seems very important for me is that when we talk about open data in general, people say, open data is great for democracy and it's great for innovation. I'm not interested in innovation in general. I'm interested in social innovation. Innovation that can bring answers to problems which are unsolved by the market. And that brings me to the third maybe big advantage that I can see in those data commons. We shouldn't see the commons as in contradiction with the market. They can live together. We can have data for the market and we can have data for the commons. But in certain situations, when the market leads us to an extreme form of capitalism, then the commons can limit this extreme form of capitalism. And so it can be sometimes complementary, and sometimes it can be a kind of resistance toward an evolution of capitalism. What are the obstacles and levers? And that will be my last point, and I will flip through it very quickly. We need legal creativity. We have to think outside of the property regime, which is complicated because included in Ostrom, when she was pushing the bundle of rights, she was thinking inside the framework of property because she was working only on natural commons, not on intellectual or knowledge commons. But I think we can inspire ourselves with the movement, the legal realism movement, which took place at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were searching to create new laws outside of the proprietary regime. We have, of course, to make the best out of the Article 20 of the GDPR with the portability, because if we can take back our data, then we will be able to decide to share it as a common or not. And of course, we have to encourage businesses who are seeking for models outside of the what I call the what we can call the attention economy, outside of the advertisement system, which is much more healthy. And those are both obstacles and levers to move forward. And just to finish, so I think that if we want to promote a genuine empowerment with the data we all produce, it's not only a question of having an individual control over it, but also a question of collective capacity to extract this social value out of it. And this is it.